The story of Joseph gives us a magnificent allegory of the Lord Jesus Christ. What Christ did, what he was to do, his life and ministry, it's all pre-written in the book of Genesis. On today's Prophecy in the News, Gary Stearman and I are going to discuss Joseph, the revealer of secrets.
Joseph reveals secrets. Today we're going to look at some of the mystical ideas behind Joseph as a type of Christ. And J.R., when Joseph is exalted over all of Egypt as second ruler by Pharaoh, it happens because he has spiritual discernment. He is able, through the power of God, that is Elohim, to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. And we read in Genesis 41:38, "And Pharaoh said unto his servants, Can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God, that is Elohim, is?" And here Pharaoh literally acknowledges the one true God. Now I find that amazing.
Yes. Also, Joseph had the Spirit of God on him. This is a type of the Lord Jesus Christ. Do you remember at Jesus' baptism? The Spirit of God came down like a dove, and the voice from heaven said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." Jesus had the Spirit of Elohim.
He did, and we find an acknowledgement of that. Now, when we think of Egypt, we think of a type of all the pagan evil you can think of in this corrupted priesthood, but at the time of Joseph, the priesthood and the true God become mingled together. We see here in the 45th verse, "And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paaneah, and he gave him to wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. And Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt." So here, Joseph is married right into a hierarchical priesthood in the city of Heliopolis, which is called On in the Bible.
Fascinating. You know, this begins the 7 good years. They were certainly good for Joseph. Joseph was taken from the prison, given royal apparel, given a nice place to live, and a beautiful wife. She was a Gentile bride.
Yes.
What a beautiful picture of New Testament Christianity, the Gentile bride of Christ.
And we have here, Josephus gives as the translation of Joseph's new name, Zaphnath-Paaneah, as the revealer of secrets. And I believe Josephus' translation because he was far closer to that time than we are. And apparently it had been handed down. But J.R., do you realize that this corresponds to Christ as well? Because Jesus has a name that no man knows. That is, it's his priestly name. And we only know his earthly name right now.
And you know, the last book in the Bible that reveals the Lord Jesus Christ to us is called the Revelation. Here is the final, ultimate revealer of secrets. Wow, that's incredible.
And here's something else that's incredible. Joseph's bride, Asenath, comes from is really a title. Her name may not have been Asenath. She may have had a long family name, but Asenath is a dedication. It means she who is of Neith. In other words, she who is dedicated to the Egyptian goddess Neith. Neith, in the Egyptian panoply of gods and goddesses, was the god of protection and provision, or the goddess of protection and provision, and she corresponds to the Greek goddess Athena. We see her with a helmet on and sometimes carrying a spear and arrows and things, and the Roman goddess Minerva, also seen wearing a helmet. And you know, Minerva really has traveled to the United States, because if you look on top of the Capitol Dome today, you'll see a helmeted goddess up there. Well, this dates all the way back to Neith, and the track of that goddess down through history seems to have followed the Gentiles. And so we find here Asenath, Joseph's wife, is the perfect type of Gentiles, and I take it to be Gentiles who believe or who are saved.
Yes. Apart from her being dedicated to Neith, who evidently was the Egyptian counterpart of the future Mystery Babylon, this woman accepted the God of her husband. So you see, we are called out of this Mystery Babylon system to believe in Jesus Christ. We are His bride. We are not like everybody else. We're not like Gentile sinners, the rejectors of Jesus. They are automatically a part of the Mystery Babylon system.
Yeah.
But we have been called out of that Mystery Babylon system, just as Abraham was called out of Babylon to go into a land that God would show him. You know, we are a special people under the Abrahamic covenant, and our husband is the Lord Jesus Christ. That's what I see in Joseph's Gentile bride.
And furthermore, we are to become part of spiritual Israel, and that happened to her. When she married Joseph, she then became the mother of two of Israel's tribes, and so became part of spiritual Israel. Isn't that fascinating?
Fascinating. Had two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And these two names of these sons seem to have a spiritual connotation as well. And I think they represent perhaps the offshoot of, or a general look at Christianity, New Testament Gentile Christianity.
And there's a deep, deep mystery in all this, because the sacred city of On, as it is called here in the Bible, or Heliopolis as it is known in the Greek, Heliopolis was supposed to be the city of the sun, the winged solar disk. You know, we've all seen pictures of the Egyptian winged solar disk. Mm-hmm. And Heliopolis, the city of the sun, was the city that symbolized the priesthood that held all of the secrets to the worship of the sun god. In other words, they were considered the priests there were considered to be masters of mathematics, masters of astronomy, masters of philosophy, and masters of the deepest spiritual matters associated with the worship of this sun god, this winged solar god. Now, the priest of Heliopolis, who is Potipharah, this would be Joseph's father-in-law, held the title greatest of seers. In other words, he was the most brilliant man in Egypt. This is all very fascinating to me, J.R., because it speaks of that which is to come, namely the mystery of the church. Behold, I show you a mystery. Paul used the word mystery several times in his epistles, and every time he used that mystery, he said, you know, there used to be things that were mysteries before Jesus came, but now that Jesus came, has come, he has clarified these mysteries. And we, as followers of Jesus, are heirs to the great mysteries which were formerly kept in the hands of a sacred priesthood.
Amazing, Gary. Joseph is such a magnificent type of the Lord Jesus Christ. The name Ephraim, for example, means fruitful. And to me, that represents Gentile Christianity in its fruitfulness, going out and winning souls. The great revivals of history, the great missionary enterprises of history. And then there, of course, is Manasseh.
Yeah, Manasseh kind of represents the dark side. In fact, the wickedest of all the kings who ever lived in Israel and Judah was named Manasseh. And so maybe the two sons represent two sides of redemption, perhaps, the redemptive process.
And Gentile Christianity. Well, this began 7 wonderful years. Now let's go back and count. Gary, we began with his being rejected by his brothers when he is 17 years old. He is now 30 years old and becomes governor of the land. And 7 wonderful, flourishing years set in. He is 37 years old when the 7-year famine begins. There's 20 years from the time he was rejected by his brothers to the time the 7 years begins. 20 years. Could that represent 2,000 years, 20 centuries?
Easily.
The possibilities are profound.
And as a matter of fact, we find multiples of 20 invariably when we're looking at the redemptive process. In fact, we find multiples of 2, 20, 200, and so forth. For example, Jesus resided 2 days with the Samaritans before moving on to Galilee, symbolizing the 2 millennia of the church. So this is quite reasonable.
Yeah, well, you know, his life begins in Genesis chapter 30 and ends in chapter 50. And so this multiple here is really important. And it's very possible that we can see here the 2,000 years of church history. And especially this 7 good years. Could that represent 700 years when the church really began to flourish? You know, it was around 1492 that Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and God began to bless, and this new land has opened up, and Christianity has seen its greatest years in the past 6, 7 centuries.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
It is.
Wow. Joseph is a magnificent type of the Lord Jesus Christ. According to the story, 7 years of famine set in across the world. Joseph had prepared for it. As the governor of Egypt under Pharaoh, he had gathered a certain percentage of the corn and the grain and had put it in storage during the 7 years of plenty. And now he was ready for 7 years of famine. When the famine came, it also came to Canaan. And his brothers and his father and the household down in the Promised Land ran out of food. And that's where we start.
As a matter of fact, in Genesis 41:54, the famine is said to be in all lands. In other words, the entire Middle East was stricken. This must have been an incredible weather phenomenon. But word got out rather quickly, as it would, that there was food in Egypt, grain down there, and grain had been stored in warehouses or grain storage houses that had been prepared because of Joseph's warning to Pharaoh. And now it all begins to pay off. And we see that when Joseph revealed the secrets in dreams, that this was not merely an exercise in mysticism. This was part of a master plan ordained by God to show to Israel, that is the sons of Jacob, hey, God's in control. He's got your life completely mapped out, and you need to know it.
Now the brothers go down into Egypt to buy corn, and they come to the governor of the land. They don't recognize him. He is their brother. And the story begins here in a fascinating way because he speaks to them in the Egyptian tongue through an interpreter in order to keep up the charade. Yeah. They do not recognize him. You know, it's fascinating to me that beginning even in the first century, the language changed. The New Testament written in Greek, the Old Testament in Hebrew. We've got a change of the languages, and the brother is not recognized.
The brother is not recognized, neither is his language. Still, you know, the house of David to this day, J.R., does not recognize the language of the New Testament as being divinely inspired. And it's kind of fascinating. We read in the 7th verse of chapter 42 here that Joseph saw his brethren, and he knew them, but made himself strange unto them and spake roughly unto them. He was a gruff boss when they came begging grain. He said, why are you here?
And he said, you're spies. That's who you are. You're spies. And he threw them into jail for 3 days. What a prophetic picture. Jesus has been rejected. He now speaks in a different language. The Koine Greek of the New Testament is far, far different from the Hebrew of the Old Testament. And we have Jesus now being the governing these 2,000 years. And when we come up to the tribulation period, which may well begin after 2,000 years, because of the numbers that are given here in Genesis concerning the 20 years when the famine started. We've got a magnificent picture here of Jesus, unrecognized, speaking roughly, throws the brothers into jail for 3 days. Could that represent 3 millennia of incarceration? All we have to do is go back to the days of Solomon. After Solomon, the land was divided. A few hundred years later, they were sent off to Babylonian captivity, the northern tribes off to Assyrian captivity, and then the Jews were under the Greeks and under the Romans, and then scattered to the slave markets of the world for 2,000 years, the wandering Jew. That's fascinating, Gary.
It is fascinating, and in 42:18 of Genesis, Joseph testifies to the brothers. He says to them, the 3rd day, this do and live, for I fear God. He gives them that testimony, and God being Elohim, the one true God, he gives a testimony to the brothers. What must they have thought when this second in command in Egypt said, I fear God? They still didn't know who he was. Did they believe him, or did they think he was playing with them?
Well, he said, I fear God.
Yeah.
And notice, please, it was on the third day. So if he kept them incarcerated, it was only a part of that third day.
Yeah.
And let's suppose they were in there for 2 days. In the morning of the third day he came. That would fit perfectly then, wouldn't it, with the beginning of the next millennium?
Perfect type. Absolutely.
And, of course, the onset of the tribulation period. And he tells them, he says, I'm going to make a bargain with you. I'm going to keep one of you here as a hostage. I want you to go back and fetch your younger brother and bring him to me. That would be Benjamin. Joseph's only full-blood brother, born of Joseph's mother, Rachel. You see, Joseph wanted to know if the brothers had treated Benjamin like they had treated him. And boy, if they had, they'd be in big trouble.
Oh, they would.
But they hadn't. They had taken care of their younger brother. And this, of course, will eventually be to their good. Notice, please, they began to talk among themselves, not realizing that Joseph can understand their language. In verse 21 of Genesis 42, as they talked to each other, they said, we are verily guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the anguish of his soul when he besought us, and we would not hear. Therefore is this distress come upon us. They had a hearing problem, Gary.
They do have a hearing problem.
And then Reuben spake unto them. He was the eldest of the group. He said, spake I not unto you, saying, do not sin against the child, and ye would not hear? Therefore also his blood is required. And they knew not that Joseph understood them, for he spake unto them by an interpreter. 3 times in this passage, we're told they have a hearing problem. And then, Gary, he takes Simeon,
Oh, yes.
their brother, and incarcerates him in an Egyptian prison, and sends the brothers back to fetch Benjamin.
He holds Simeon hostage.
Yes. Now, the name Simeon means hearing.
Yeah.
So 4 times here, we are set up for a prophetic scenario that Israel will be without their spiritual hearing. Amazing.
Again, this is a beautiful picture of the church age, starting with the fact that we have a Gentile bride in this picture. We have the great spiritual mysteries of the kingdom revealed to Joseph. He's a seer, if you will. And he's a believer. He testifies of Elohim to these brothers, but their hearing is stopped up. You get the feeling that they really don't understand what he's doing or saying.
That's right. They just don't understand. They don't get it.
Don't get it.
To use a modern cliche. Now, I want you to notice Isaiah chapter 6. When Isaiah saw the Lord high and lifted up, his train filled the temple, God said, whom shall I send and who will go for us? And Isaiah volunteered. God said then, go tell the people, hearing, and you will not be able to understand. Hearing, and you will not understand. Seeing, ye shall see and not perceive. Hearing, ye shall hear and not understand. And when Jesus came, he spoke in parables, which was a frustration to the people. They couldn't understand. And so in Matthew 13, verse 9, Jesus said, who hath ears to hear, let him hear. And the disciples came to him and said, we don't understand. What are you talking about? He said, well, it's because Isaiah said, hearing ye shall hear and shall not understand. That's what Simeon's all about right here. Their spiritual hearing is dulled. And to this day, the Jewish people have a difficult time understanding who Jesus is and who we are, Gentile Christianity. They just don't understand. This is the spiritual Simeon.
Do you know something? Through all of this, Joseph still loves his brothers.
Yes.
Never lets them down. In fact, he gives them grain to take back on their trip, and he refunds the money for the grain, hides it in their sacks. Now, that's an interesting symbol.
And you know, Gary, for these past 2,000 years, even though Jesus has been rejected by his brothers, God has blessed the Jewish people financially.
Yes, he has.
And
Kept them going.
Yeah, to me, this certainly is spoken of here when
Though
they put
they,
the money back in the sacks.
Yeah, they've been sent back, and the Jews have been spread all over the world, and yet everywhere they go, though they're not able to take root, nevertheless, they prosper. And this is the blessing of God. And I think this money in the sack is a prophecy of that.
Wow, there is so much to tell here in the story of Joseph. And on our next program, we're going to try to wrap this up and see all these magnificent spiritual meanings involved here, especially when Joseph reveals himself.